Hi, I'd like to present two videos inspired to some extent by the convulsions taking place here in the United States right now and to some extent abroad. This video will regard a society that forgets or repudiates its roots and that believes its history is settled. I'll make another video after this on the illusion of the self, which will be thematically related to some extent. Now, some of you may have seen my video on oikophobia or listened to my podcast interview on it or read my Quillette article on the subject, namely cultural self-hatred. And you know that this is a topic that is obviously very much in the news right now, with mobs of left-wing radicals running amok across the country and almost literally tearing down American history. But I've sometimes been asked why it is necessarily so important to keep one's roots in mind. Why is a culture something that at almost all costs should be preserved? There's a fairly straightforward answer to these questions. Culture and its sources should be preserved at almost any cost because they are things that are greater than we are. When young Westerners sympathize with various communist or anarchist groups, they do so not primarily because they have suffered economic marginalization or discrimination at the hands of Western society, unlike what their apologists would have you believe. Rather, they join or sympathize with these groups because the Western society in which they live has failed to provide them with something that is greater than they are. Well-meaning Westerners believe that we need only provide more jobs and less economic or racial discrimination for such youngsters to embrace the West and reject radicalism. It's true that economics plays an extremely important role in ethics formation, but the force of culture and the human search for greater meaning are often at least as powerful as the stability of a regular paycheck. And the economy, until very recently, before the virus, was in fact booming, and discrimination, contrary to the story that sensationalist headlines would have you believe, is in fact at a historical low. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it is lower now than it has ever been before. Now, this last point is important. Success, wealth, and leisure serve as catalysts in the rise of oikophobia, cultural self-hatred, and so the protesters tend to be middle class, not lower class, as might appear more intuitive. It is those who are better off who have time to ponder the world's injustices, while those of the lower social strata are too busy scraping by a living. A truly poor and oppressed people does not even know how poor and oppressed it is. It is progress that suddenly instills among them the idea that things could be better, and the explosion follows. This is a predictable pattern of history that repeats itself. For example, the French Revolution did not take place under the despotism of Louis XIV or the incompetence of Louis XV, but under the reformer, Louis XVI, albeit also quite incompetent. So too, in the 20th century, the more successful the colonial European powers were in developing underdeveloped societies, the stronger became the indigenous reaction and yearning for freedom. And so the Marxist theory, gleaned first from the Communist Manifesto, that revolutions are a result of misery, is not entirely false in every instance, but must certainly be modified. It is possible, of course, to agree with some particular protest in history, but one can nonetheless recognize the irony in the fact that the protests are partly a result of successful governmental response to widespread grievance. To get back to the present situation, in order to provide today's hooligans with something greater than they, Western society must come to recall again what it largely forgot in the 1960s and 70s, namely its own roots. When culture, that which is greater than our own selves, is forgotten, a narcissistic attitude centered on the notion of the self develops. And this is what I want to talk a little bit about in the next video, which I'll release in maybe a week or so. But this self-obsession, which is brought to its logical continuation by the rise of social media, where no thought is thought and no feeling felt that is not broadcast to all and sundry, only masks the natural human desire to be part of something greater, of historical events, of heroism, of struggle. This is where those left-wing ideologies, and at other times in history right-wing ideologies, that pretend that great struggle and redemption are still ahead of us, step in to fill the vacuum. Westerners then become easy targets for those radical ideologies seeking to exploit that human desire for greater meaning. This is part of the reason why it is naive to presume, as many thinkers over the last few decades appear to have done, that liberal Western-style democracy entails a sort of end of history. People like Francis Fukuyama and Steven Pinker come to mind, for example. Although in fairness to Fukuyama, and unlike Pinker, he is not as naive as he sometimes may seem. In the end of history, Fukuyama does write as follows: Experience suggests that if men cannot struggle on behalf of a just cause, because that just cause was victorious in an earlier generation, then they will struggle against the just cause. They will struggle for the sake of struggle. They will struggle, in other words, out of a certain boredom, for they cannot imagine living in a world without struggle. And if the greater part of the world in which they live is characterized by peaceful and prosperous liberal democracy, then they will struggle against that peace and prosperity and against democracy. And this is exactly correct. Any success will always be taken to its extreme, and there will always be a backlash, and the struggle will recommence in one form or other. This is why we must never take democracy and our core values for granted. If we do, which we do by forgetting the ancient cultures that produced that democracy and those values, then we will begin to lose them, since the next generation will no longer be inspired by them and will therefore reject them, even though, of course, they won't actually have any idea of what it is exactly that they're rejecting. And so, as hackneyed as it may sound, the current unrest is mainly a failure of education, not a result of social marginalization. Some might wonder, if it is a failure of education that we're talking about here, why do we also see these anarchic protests at our elite educational institutions? Well, the answer to that is very simple. At the risk of sounding like a grumpy old man, things aren't what they used to be. If you speak with students in the humanities at even top universities like Harvard or Princeton or Oxford, you'll find how very little most of them actually know. The millennial generation like to state with perfect seriousness that they are America's most educated generation. They say this because statistics show that they have more college degrees than any other American generation. What they do not understand is that the content of a college degree has changed radically across the decades, in part by becoming more diffused, and that today such a degree typically does not lead to anywhere close to the same quantity and quality of education as was the case in some previous eras. So the mere fact that the millennials fail to grasp the very simple concept that the meaning and content of terms, in this case college degree, change over time, shows precisely how very poor their education has been. There are also other reasons for the treason of intellectuals, but that will be discussed in detail in my book on orgophobia. And so a start to ending our troubles in this destructive era would be to introduce the young to the beauty of Western art. To play a part in this creative force, to express it and develop it in beauty for others to behold, is the most loving act in which human beings can engage, and is of course the literal opposite of the ignorant iconoclasm we see all around us. To engage with tonality, the full symphony orchestra, the contrapposto, chiaroscuro, metopes, skyscrapers, poetry and prose, iambic pentameter and dactylic hexameter, to mention just a few examples, is to engage with Western beauty and to cherish its ideals. For all these innovations, and many others, arose from a tradition of dissent, open debate, and the free exchange of ideas, which are also Western phenomena. Wherever they are found outside of the West, it is mostly because of Westernization. To destroy statues is to bring our civilization backward toward the very beginning when nothing existed. To engage in this beauty that I have mentioned and in this education, that is to carry our civilization forward. Thank you for watching.